Starting at my far right, there's Vernon Burton. I love saying this part. He was born near 96, South Carolina. That's a place. He is the Judge Matthew J. Perry Jr., Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University. He's a highly regarded historian on race in America, and he's a sought-after expert witness in voting rights litigation. That's how we first came to know each other. He is the co-author with Armand Durfner, also an old friend. He's a legendary civil rights lawyer. They are co-authors of a book, Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court. It's a beautifully written book that tells the stories of significant cases and engages all of us as citizens in understanding what our Constitution ought to be, while showing us what Supreme Court justices interpret it to be in particular moments of our history. Next to him is Heather McGhee. She designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Is she in the right place? She currently chairs the board of Color of Change, the nation's largest online racial justice organization, and has shared her ideas in a TED Talk. Racism Has a Cost for Everyone. That's the name of the TED Talk. Her book is The Sum of Us, and it's subtitled, What Racism Cost Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. This book makes the case that racism thoroughly corrupts our society and prevents everyone from experiencing what she calls the solidarity dividend, the benefits we could share in a future without racism. And I am particularly happy to introduce Patricia Sullivan. She is a summer resident and a member of the Book Festival's advisory board. She's, yes. She is a professor of history at the University of South Carolina and a leading civil rights historian. Her new book, Justice Rising, Robert Kennedy's America in Black and White, is a deeply researched portrait of Kennedy's civil rights record and has been widely praised by historians Douglas Brinkley, Kenneth Mack, who is around here somewhere, Cornel West, and Jeffrey Sachs, among others. These brief introductions do a great injustice to the credentials and experiences of all three panelists, but we'd be here all day if I told you all about them. So we were asked to discuss race and exclusion. And as I was thinking about how to talk about that, I kept being visited by Bob Moses, who died last week. He and Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer were incredible partners in transforming Mississippi with its civil rights movement, and in the process transforming America. And Bob Moses continued his work long after the 60s. I mean, he continued to be a social justice warrior. He started the Algebra Project that was based on a philosophy of math and a commitment to justice. So he was an amazing person. He was often here on the Vineyard. Mrs. Hamer was a sharecropper in Mississippi when she became involved with SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee that Bob Moses was hooked up with. So as Bob continued to evolve in his thinking, he became focused on the preamble to our Constitution, which, as we all know, begins, "We the people." And he just started meditating on that. We the people. And he believes that we should start thinking about that preamble as an organizing tool. We should think about that preamble as giving us our responsibility to expand who is included in that class of people who decide what happens in this country. That's who we the people are. And our whole history is a history of expanding who gets included in we the people. As you know, enslaved people in the United States were not included in we the people for a very long time, and I'm feeling like we're being pushed out again. but that will be discussed. So I want us to think about we the people. The other thing I want us to think about is Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was one of the greatest organizers of the civil rights movement. And when I was a young organizer, I used to sit in her kitchen as often as I could, hoping that some of her wisdom would finally sink in and make sense to me, that I could use it. And one of the things she just hammered on was that it was critical to always know in any given moment where you are. Mm-hmm. And what she meant by that is that it is critical to understand what the situation of your community is all about. What are the factors? What are the forces? What is actually going on in your community in any particular moment? You have to know where you are. And both of these people embody a great tradition of Black Mississippians, where I now live and where I worked as a young organizer and voting rights litigator. And there's a wonderful expression about how you make a way out of no way. How do you make a way out of no way? And they understood that that's what they were doing as they mobilized around the civil rights movement there. So what I want us to do in this conversation is follow their lead. Pat, your book captures the 1960s world of Bob Moses and Mrs. Hamer. Mm-hmm. And you capture it in a conversation that Burke Marshall has with Bobby Kennedy after Burke Marshall, who was with the Justice Department, has met with George Wallace about the desegregation of the University of Alabama. So in this phone call, Burke Marshall says to Bobby Kennedy, it's a foreign country. It's a different mind and a different world and a different civilization. So now I want to turn, so that's the 60s of Bob Moses and Mrs. Hamer. So where are we now? I think we are in a no-way situation when it comes to issues of racial justice in this country. The presidential election shows us that 72 million people live in that world as described by Burke Marshall. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party is committed to white supremacy. The Supreme Court is clearing the way for states to disenfranchise Black people, just as was done to destroy the first Reconstruction. The states are censoring the teaching of history. Any history that challenges the mythology of white supremacy is being censored in state after state by state legislatures controlled by Republicans. That's this BS you hear about critical race theory and can't teach the 1619 Project. This is what it's really about. Now, not to, be all, doom and gloom. We do have the Black Lives Matter movement. That has mobilized more people in the United States and around the world than ever participated in all the civil rights demonstrations combined. And Joe Biden and Kamala Harris did win the election. Okay, we got that. Okay, now, but our country is engaged in excruciating struggles over issues of race and exclusion, including economic inequality and racial disparities and opportunities of every kind. These three people have written wonderful books in addition to the ones that are mentioned here. But I want to ask the three of you to talk with each other and with us about a key lesson from our history that should guide us forward. Vernon, I know you got some ideas.
Well, first let me just say what it means to me to be back at Martha's Vineyard, and thank you so much for including me, Sue Ellen, and the committee. And being here is particularly special. Sheldon Hatney was my PhD advisor at Princeton, and he and Lucy are role models, literally, for what a citizenship should be doing, and maybe some people to look to for what we should be doing now. As I think about it, both Georgianne and I have always thought of them as truly role models for citizenship. I'm always a little reluctant when people ask about what we learn from history, and it does remind me, since we're close to Boston, of David Donald when the busing crisis occurred there. And David Donald was a professor at Harvard. I taught for 34 years at the University of Illinois, a school that I really treasure my time there. And he was our most illustrious PhD. And so when they asked him about what would Lincoln have thought about and done about the busing situation in Boston, he thought a minute and he said, well, the first thing Lincoln would have said is, what is a bus? And that can be a lesson for us, I think. We have to know our history. There may not be lessons, but we come out of our history. We grow out of the events we're in now are exactly there. Whereas at the time, from Pat's book, the quote that you gave by Burt Marshall, basically it seems to me that what we've done is, instead of the South being changed, I think it was changed, but the same methods are being used to become more nationwide in states that we don't associate with the former Confederacy. But it's disastrous not to know your history. And I'm a little more hopeful, I think, Barbara, in another way, and that is, I remember when I went to graduate school, there was the whole debate about slavery and the Civil War many years ago, before most of you were born, actually. And yet, because that history has now gotten down into the public schools, and these public school teachers are doing God's work if they'll leave them alone, and no one questions that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. They really don't. I mean, I remember when Haley Barbour was head of the Republican Party, he says, of course slavery was there. And yet, as late as 1990, I was debating Sons of the Confederacy on Ken Burns' movie, which were arguing otherwise. And for the sesquicentennial, they then asked me to ask Ken Burns to come speak to them. So I think there is hope in education, but you have to know the facts. History is critical thinking. I've often said two things changed the South, the Voting Rights Act and air conditioning, and we understand how air conditioning works better when we do the Voting Rights Act. But it's sort of humorous, but there's more to it. Of course, STEM education is important, but critical thinking, which you learn through history, and I'm not talking about alternative facts, I'm talking about the history that's there, that goes into the schools. I think it can make a difference. You cannot look at our history and understand what has happened from the session before us about the displacement of Native Americans to slavery to Jim Crow. And it's not just the end of slavery. One of the things that Armour Deferred and I discovered in doing this book, we've had 12 generations of legalized white supremacy and white privilege, and only 2 generations now, literally, of trying to address those things. And even though we're moving back the other way, we have made progress, and we have to keep working at it. And it is people like the Hackneys and others who give us examples. But while there may not be examples of history, I think history is the critical way to move forward. And there is a danger. We did it before, even in 1980, the great historian C. Van Woodward worried about the return to what had happened after Reconstruction, as he saw the resegregation of America in other ways that were going on in the demographics at the time and things. So there is the possibility of that, but we have to be vigilant and not let it happen. And the vote is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and Heather, before you jump in the conversation, let me push back on that a little bit, Vernon, because these Republican states are passing legislation right now to censor the teaching of that very history that you think is going to make a difference. The leader of the Mississippi State Legislature was famously at the Neshoba County Fair just last week, talking about how Mississippi is going to put a stop to teaching racism in the schools. Yes. Heather, help us out.
I think that the lesson that I take from history, and I'm not an historian, and I wrote a book about the economy and race, really from a perspective of trying to advance economic policies to make the American dream more real for more people, and running up against the forces of history and running up against racism in our politics. And yet I felt like if I was going to write a book about today, the economy, inequality, wages, consumer protections, all of that, I couldn't exclude just a little bit of history, right? You can't know what is going on unless you know 10, 20, 50, 80 years behind you. And yet so many people who read my book say, I'm outraged that I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. There's a feeling of folks feeling like they've been robbed of their own history and they've been lied to. And that is really what we're talking about. And so the lesson that I take from history, Barbara, for that beautiful, provocative question that I will keep with me is A, that everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. And that most of us, have been lied to about many things. And in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center put out a study about the state of history education and race education in America, and found that less than 10% of high school seniors surveyed could accurately name that slavery was a primary cause of the Civil War. So when you say that everybody knows that, I think you mean among historians. But the lost cause, right, which is something that, many of us in the North didn't know about until it came north. The idea that with a little organizing and a little work, you could change the story of history. And it began immediately as the Confederacy was losing. You had the same people who said it is about white supremacy now and forever began to talk about states' rights as if it was the right to knit, right? The right to put up a railroad somewhere, right? I mean, it was a completely disembodied sense of what the right was, right? The right was obviously to own other human beings. And so that same move, the idea that organized people, and I will note, mainly women, this was what white women in the South took up as their civic cause, was the lost cause of changing school books, of making sure that pageants and festivals inculcated the idea of Southern innocence, and maintained the idea of separate races, and maintained the idea that it was a war of northern aggression. That is what is happening right now. This attack on honest education, which is what I call what is happening right now, where we have 11 states banning forms of education about race and racism that make students feel uncomfortable, discomfort, guilt, or anguish about what people of their race might have done in the past. This is literally legislation banning that, telling school districts, as in Tennessee, if a teacher knowingly violates this law, they lose $1 million in the first instance. The school does. Then $5 million. So this is empowering a mom to say that there was a lesson about Ruby Bridges desegregating schools in Louisiana, and it made her child uncomfortable. Ruby Bridges was 6. But somehow this child today, who was in, I think, the 5th grade, should be protected from the knowledge of what a 6-year-old had to do to access the education that this contemporary white child is sitting in. So this is a 5-alarm fire. And I think everyone is outraged and confused that this could possibly be happening. But I think there's a direct line between Charlottesville, January 6th, and these attacks on honest education. And this is what is happening. Books are being banned. We know who bans books. We know what is happening. And so I would say, as a simple call to action, everyone who is nodding their heads and feeling their throats start to tighten, because it is very scary, has to speak out. Now, you may live in Massachusetts where this may not be going on. In Rhode Island, there's organizing around this. In every school district, there is some school district council, school board meeting where the crazies are coming out and talking about this. And it's not just in the South, and it's not just in Texas. And so if you have not spoken up, called your state legislator, called your school board, those who might be retired, you might have to go and run for school board because otherwise we've got recall petitions and it's a really scary place. So please, I implore you, take some action in your community to make sure that you are defending honest education.
Let me say one of the things I didn't say about Heather, but it's in her bio. She was, for many years, the president of Demos, which she transformed into it was a think tank when she showed up, but it became a think and do tank. Pat, what are your thoughts?
Well, everything that's just been said is really so important, and where the struggles are in schools, but also around voting, and to make the changes and really engage in the ways that Heather has suggested is really sort of holding on to that right and really facing this rollback that we're going through, that Vernon struggles so much with in court. And I'm so glad that you started by mentioning Bob Moses, because today is the 56th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. And the story of what it took, talk about making a way out of no way. Okay, and this is where history is really important, living in your moment. And knowing in your moment you may not transform, but are you going to stop and push back and move forward? And that was one of the things I learned in my book. When I decided to write this book, I was interested in looking at the 60s, new questions. And Robert Kennedy sort of became, surprisingly to me, became my way in, because he was someone who was looking, seeing, learning from people, traveling around the country, and he came into office at a pivotal moment. But the year 1960, because the story of what it took to get to the Voting Rights Act is a thread in the first half of my book. And the elements are just not connected in the beginning, but they come together. And a critical one is Bob Moses. Bob Moses, New York born, sees the sit-ins, says, they look how I felt. Goes to Atlanta to find out about it, to get involved, ends up being sent by Miss Baker into Mississippi to get people to come to a meeting that October of 1960. He gets there and he meets Amzie Moore. He meets World War II veterans who are determined to vote. And in Mississippi, you are risking not only your livelihood, but your life. And we know, those of us who study this history, people gave their lives. So you have Bob coming into Mississippi, listening to those people, and committing himself. He had to go back and teach high school to come back the next summer. You have John Doerr that same summer of 1960. John Doerr is working in his father's law practice in New Richmond, Wisconsin. And he gets an offer, he was like third or fourth on the list, to come into the Justice Department in 1960, at the end of the Eisenhower administration, to be the top assistant in the Civil Rights Division. He said he went because it had to be more interesting than practicing law in New Richmond. So he's there, right? It's toward it. And then John Kennedy is elected in November of 1960. And on his first day as Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy goes to John Doerr's desk and says, what are you working on? And it was a voting case in Louisiana. And that convergence of those individuals, right, at that moment, and the connection with the generations of African American men and women who've been struggling for generations to sustain, claim, and get the right to vote. That's 1960-61. This unfolds over several years. And what it took to get the Voting Rights Act. We think of legislation and Congress. No, this is coming here, and it's being, Thurgood Marshall described the Justice Department during Robert Kennedy's tenure as an arm of the Civil Rights Movement. And sometimes activists thought it didn't move as fast, but they were in concert. They were in a common endeavor, and they were patient, and they struggled. And I think when you know what it was like then, and as Baldwin said, if you don't know what happened around you, you have no idea what's going on around you. And this history that we sort of take for granted, because we know the Voting Rights Act happened then, where did that come from? And I think that now, as we're living through after the decision in 2013, really gutting a major part. And that part of Section 5 was written out of the experience of these attorneys who went in and saw what Bob and all the people, Fannie Lou Hamer, were up against, that you had to really make it clear and you had to review any changes. I mean, that was pivotal, but that came out of experience of these attorneys going in. So here we are, right? Voting rights are under assault throughout the country. And I think what we can learn from history is it's our time. It's our time. And it's at every level, right? To me, to really see this making a way out of no way, that is the story of the Black freedom struggle throughout our history. And in the 1960s, a lot changed. And then we had the pushback. I mean, the later half of the 60s, it exposed so much beyond the South about how deep race was, the structures of racism and all the rest, and opened up new struggles that around criminal justice, around urban poverty, deep segregation throughout the country. Not now, I mean, not after, but then, simultaneous. I mean, people had migrated during the first half of the 20th century. But to me, and the last time I saw Bob, we were working in John Doerr's papers in Princeton in 2019, and Bob was going back, just wanting to know more about that time when he lived and what they did and what it was like, and to really share that. And he'd asked me if I'd come to Princeton in the fall and present with him on that. So Bob was going back to his history, and to his relationship with Doerr and all that involved. So I think history, in that sense, the questions we ask, what we find, and how we sort of pick up the battle, because people really changed a lot. And I think we forget that. It really is bad now. But we have to remember what did change and how it changed, and making a way out of no way, I think, is the theme. Thanks.
Can I just add what Pat said about Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act? We just had a case really recently that went after Section 2, this changing what's going on as well. So it's not just that this is just the last Supreme Court thing, and those were the two things that mainly give a way to do anything to challenge these cases.
The way you opened, Barbara, speaking about we the people and how I feel like I can't call him Bob because I did not have the joy of ever knowing Mr. Moses, but that he'd begun to focus on this question. I too think those are, three of the most important civic words ever written because they've always been so contested. The name of the organization where I served, demos, is the Greek word for the people of a nation and the root word of democracy. And fundamentally, this question of who are we to one another, who counts as fully human, who counts as a citizen, whose rights should be respected, who belongs, who deserves. Those are fundamentally, that's it, right? That's everything we're talking about. Social security, healthcare, infrastructure, childcare, democracy, money in politics, all of that, it fundamentally comes down to that. And that's where the original lie upon which our economic model was founded in this country, which is the lie of human hierarchy, the lie that of the belief in a hierarchy of human value is still with us and is still being contested all the time through policy, through politics, through representation and narrative. And I do think that, there was a poll that recently came out, a Pew poll, that I think helps explain a little bit why we are seeing the big lie, right? The lie, the idea that some forces, some nefarious forces in cities illegally voted and stole the election from the legitimate president. The big lie, which is the basis now, it was, voter fraud was what, on sort of an individual scale was the basis for the wave of voter suppression that we saw after 2010. But now it's sort of on steroids, and it's the big lie is the basis for this current wave of voter suppression. That lie is fundamentally predicated on a very racist common sense. And so the idea of the sum of us in my book is that racism has a cost for everyone. When you have people in power, using lies to distort, to divide, it ultimately weakens all of the things that we hold in common, including our democracy and our economy. It creates inequality. And so that has a cost for everyone. But I think about what is going on with the stealth and sometimes flagrant attacks on democracy, and fundamentally they come down to that racist common sense that it's as possible that Black and brown people voting in cities are doing something criminal by doing that as they are being true citizens who are legitimate citizens exercising the right to vote, right? Like, you have to have that as a common sense to think that there's this mass wave of criminality stealing an election from, let's face it, the person who still nonetheless won the majority of white voters, right? And so that's really what's going on like a gut level common sense, the idea that this could have been stolen from, the rightful owners of this country. And that is why we need the policy work. But just as Kennedy, just as King, just as so many of our greatest leaders truly understood, we also need the hearts and minds work, right? And I think that right now the people who understand that very well are those who are using collective stories and media and consciousness and emotion to drive us apart rather than those who are looking to drive us together. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, was to try to give us a common story that would make us reject this zero-sum notion, this idea that what's good for one group has to be bad for the other and vice versa, to sort of bring us into a common sense of a collective fight against these systems that are harming us all, from our planet to our schools.
And Demos also reminds me of Demography. And it's another thing that actually gives me hope. And, I've testified to this and written about it. But certainly Texas has become a minority state. And politicians are well aware of that. Florida is on its way, predictions 2030. The U.S. itself, which just when I was coming of age was just overwhelmingly what we consider white, whatever that is now, about 60% or something? And I think there's hope there too. And I think it's also what's driving a lot of the fear of voters and others, and the mobilization of voters. And having studied demagogues like Pitchfork, Ben Tillman in South Carolina, sometimes of the late 19th, early 20th century, I think some of these folks just took off their overalls and put on coats and ties and went to New York City, and using racial demagogue techniques. It's very similar. Again, it's a danger to take and say this, you take from this episode in history and place it today. But I think that's a lot of what is going on. And we've faced these kind of problems before, and I think we have to put them on. And these kind of books that Pat and that you've done, Heather, I think make a huge difference to show that.
Pat, I can see you about to say something.
Yeah, but the question, is what do we do? And I think Heather's book really opens up the challenge and the opportunity. And that was the demand and the opportunity. And I think people in the 60s, across race, responded not just to the demand, but to the opportunity. The sit-ins exploded, just took off, eclipsed the Cold War politics of the 50s. It really opened up American political culture in a dramatic way. And I think we lose sight of, when we see how far we've slipped back, we often lose sight of that. And that is really powerful. And I also think activism and acting, and I think social media kind of short circuits a lot of that today. But people, what did Marion Wright say about Kennedy? And this is true about Bob Moses and so many people who interacted with the people on the front lines in the Southern struggle. He went, he saw, he listened. He listened. A student of mine called him a radical listener. She said, Pat, that you chose Robert Kennedy was a radical listener. And he grew. And he was in a position that he could, connect things up. But I think so much is, not to go on that last night's noise thing, but so much is out there that we don't have control of. And it's so powerful, as you say, Heather, the stories. But what do we do? Because it seems action is what changes people's hearts and minds. Coming together, creating those spaces to do that. And it's a very different time from the 60s, but we face very similar challenges. And it's sort of, how do we, people who have had the opportunity of education and all that, how do we use that in our world? Not as, so we'll do this no, every day. How do we orient ourselves and use what we have? Like Robert Moses, he was an MA in philosophy from Harvard when he ended up in Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer taught him. Yeah. He learned from people there. And they created a revolution. And the timing was good, because you had people in Washington for a short time who were learning from them. And the synergy, I mean, it was transformative. I mean, President Kennedy, in his June 11th speech, talked about the revolution that was happening. And Robert Kennedy at Berkeley, the most important thing is the revolution within our gates by African Americans for full equality and full freedom. But so that's, how do we think about that as people working at different sides of this question and challenge? Because, Heather, I think your book really just reminds us is that most people, white people, are disadvantaged by this kind of politics that's built on race. I mean, you look at the wages of whiteness and you may feel a little better, but really you're suffering with 3 jobs and all these poor health care and the rest.
Heather, you're the doer here. You are the activist. And let me ask you, I was intrigued by your book, and to throw in some history here. We have had moments in our history where blacks and whites came together and understood their commonality. You know, we've had the Tenant Farmers Union in Arkansas. We've had Mississippi Gulf Coast pulpwood workers, black and white, came together for a while. We've had these things happen for a while. So we're talking now about these serious threats to our democracy that are happening right now. Their race is being used to drive challenges to democracy at every turn. We've had these recognitions of what we have in common that have been fleeting. How are we going to do it differently this time?
So, I mean, that's really the question, ultimately. And there are instances in the sum of us, you know, going back to Bacon's Rebellion, right, going back to colonial Virginia, a cross-racial servant uprising of black and white that ended up burning the capital of Virginia and chasing the colonial governor out into hiding. And after that, you saw the beginning of what we sort of know now to be the racially based hierarchy of human value, the taking away of rights and property from African enslaved people and the basically giving it to white-skinned people, the pardoning of the white people who were part of the rebellion and the sort of hardening of the color line, because they said, well, hold on now, they who said it was the plantation elite, right? The colonial elite said, oh, we are vastly outnumbered here if y'all start getting together. This is a major problem. And so let us make sure that what white people are here, A, let's stop importing so many white people. And B, let us make sure that the white people who are here know that they should side with us, no matter what their class or station or job or land or lack thereof. And that's been the okie doke ever since, right? So that's been the tension and the wages of whiteness that Barbara mentioned, of course, W.B. Du Bois, beautiful passage talking about what could be talked about in basically any shop floor, you know, across the country. Part of the book, I go to Jackson, Mississippi, where a Nissan plant had just, the workers who were eligible to vote, the Nissan plant had just voted against organizing. And I grew up in Chicago, so I knew that, you know, labor organized car factory jobs, the best jobs, you know, you can get, right? So the idea of somebody saying, no, I don't want a pension and health care and, you know, all that was just like, wait, what's going on here? Why would somebody do that to themselves? And when I went down there, it turned out that race was really the hidden story, right? That it was this wages of whiteness. The idea, as one of the workers said, if the blacks are for it, I'm against it. You know, this sense that the union meant equality, and they'd rather have, you know, a little bit of advantage and that feeling of superiority than the equality, even if equality would bring them material wages. They'd rather have the psychological wages. But that's from a story, right? And so I really think it's important for us to always remember who's selling that story for their own profit and not just who's buying it.
Right.
So often we, particularly I think with social media and everything, we can get focused on, each other, right? As opposed to the people who are self-consciously using division and racist narratives for their own profit. And that's where, I'm so glad we're having conversations at the festival about, the role of social media and Facebook and the way that, that what used to be something that we could, share our kid pictures and our cat pictures on has really become a tool of the plutocracy, has really become a tool of the self-interested elite, that its profits are driven by the more hate and outrage and division that exists, the more money is in those shareholders' pockets. And that's really important for us to recognize as citizens. But just quickly to answer your direct question, I think we are actually at a boom time in organizing, right? I think the last 4 years made super citizens out of millions of people who said, what I'm going to do with my girlfriends is I'm going to write postcards. I'm going to stand on the corner. I'm going to door knock, right? That this I had never seen that in my life. I know that, I grew up hearing about it in the 60s, but it certainly was not the America that I grew up with in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so it's really important that we not go back, to brunch, right? That we continue to be vigilant about what's happening in our country and in our name. And, I toggle between fear and outrage about, the backlash and the organizing of the right around racial resentment. And, and I want to distinguish that from Republicans. I'm a partisan person. I've, fought to elect Democrats, but, I think we should have a multi-party system, and I think that we should have people who have different ideas about how to order society. But what's happening right now is very different. It's not about how to order society. It's about who should be in society and who's really human and who belongs. And that is where I think we need to fight to draw a line. But I think, as you said, Barbara, the Black Lives Matter movement, all of the organizing that has happened, the consciousness shifting that has happened, that has largely been driven by multiracial coalitions. And, yes, a lot of African Americans were not as active, 10 years ago, 15 years ago as we are now. But really, when you're starting to get that, this is about people who are not Black saying, I don't want this to be happening in our name. And that is wonderful. And I think no progress has ever actually happened without that multiracial coalition. We didn't get the Voting Rights Act on our own, right? How many Black people were there in Congress when there was the Voting Rights Act? That was not us, right? That was an alliance, a coalition, abolition. All of the movements that have happened have been organized and led by the affected communities, but ultimately it has needed people to come together and say, we can do this. And I think that is the moment we're in. That's why we're seeing a backlash, but it's why we can't take our foot off the gas in terms of making sure that this sea change in organizing and in consciousness translates into policy change. That is the most important thing.
Let me just add, because you mentioned the lost cause, that's a great example, and I think the greatest example from history and the most misunderstood, the most progressive period was the interracial democracy of Reconstruction,
Yes,
when
that's right.
Republicans, Black and white, came together and overcame, at least for a period of time, race, and it took a coup d'etat. It took a coup d'etat in America that is terrorism, which didn't begin in 9/11. African Americans had lived in that, at least till the Voting Rights Act. It literally was a paramilitary overthrow of a legitimately elected interracial group of people who then happened to be the Republican Party. And yet we have, well, I think we disagree on this. I think we've come to understand slavery is caused a civil war in the high school text or anything, unless they try to keep writing it out. We still don't see Reconstruction now, and it's still used. Even testimony, I've heard it come up in recent court cases, the horrors of Reconstruction. They don't mean the horrors that you and I and Pat think about. They're talking about the horrors of Black people voting. And it wasn't until recently when finally they were able to get the Confederate flag in Washington, D.C. Capitol, in this riot that we've had anything pretty much like that since the ends of the 1898 Wilmington and Phoenix and riots like that against black people voting. But it was a working interracial democracy, and we got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment at that time. So I think that's what we have to be so vigilant about.
Well, let me just follow up on that a little bit. Last summer, I was pretty optimistic that we were moving in the direction of a third Reconstruction. And I think listening to you, Heather and Vernon, you all are hopeful that we are moving in the direction of a third Reconstruction. But sometimes I think we're headed into redemption, that period that destroyed the first Reconstruction. Pat, where do you think we are?
I think we're sort of where Heather described. I think it's, for me, I mean, we are in a racial reckoning. We haven't, that echoes the 1960s. It's all out there, right? It's all out there. Black Lives Matter, the protests, you can't look away. It's there. I mean, you can mobilize reaction, but it's there. And again, I think, like the earlier decade, there's a demand and there's opportunity. There's opportunity. And how it goes is really in play. But I think the fact that we're facing, our country is facing this and maybe trying to manipulate it as the way you say, Heather, but it's there. And so it's an opening to really organize, teach history. I think history is, and it's generational. We don't have to go, I mean, the New Deal era, my gosh, I mean, Virginia Durr's birthday is today. I mean, she worked with Charles Hamilton Houston, she worked with NAACP in the South. There was a terrific interracial activism, huge, Popular Front, cross all kinds of boundaries, that was really pushed back in the Cold War era, repression. Targeting, right? Du Bois arrested. So we need to, it's a constant fight, and it's our generations, ages, it's now. And the fact, as you pointed out, Heather, people are organizing and active in ways that they haven't been. And so I think it's an opportunity, and whether it's a third Reconstruction or redemption, it remains to be seen. But I think it's in the hands of all who are seeing, and how you use that knowledge and that politics and organizations to really, because it's a very dangerous moment. And I think people are I mean, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, as much as it's been sanitized or tried to be, it can't be, I mean, it there it is. And I think it illuminates so much of what you've
I know you
keep
on pause just for a
moment.
minute, Vernon. I want to let people know to come to the microphones to ask questions. You go on.
To emphasize what both people have said, I think if we look at it as a teachable moment, all of this, not just right, I think it's very important. But as you know, Barbara, my editor kept taking out of the previous book I wrote, I called on people not to use the term redemption. As a person of faith, that is a beautiful word to me. No, but this is important, I think, because the other side has used the language. They control the language. And so, and it's not just then. This is a teachable moment. Redemption, describing this overthrow of a legitimate government, just like they use the words today and set up authoritarianism by saying these kind of things, everything from critical race theory. They grab these words, and we can't let that happen. That's why I'm so happy you have a Martha's Vineyard book fair that people can read and are caring about discussing these things. But it is a teachable moment, and it is one of the lessons from history. The language you use becomes so important, and it is partly what demagogues use to get people to vote against their own economic interest and their children's interest, despite what is going on, what's really happening, that separation.
All right, we've got some questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you all so much. I have two quick questions. One, I wanted to just ask you to speak a little bit more, if possible, about the functioning of a lie as a form of denial. And so I know in all of our communities, when someone does something they're ashamed of, they make up a big BS thing to cover it up, and they cling to that. And that's what scares me the most, is the usurping of language. And so even the lie you were telling about, those same people are trying to get us to not know about voter suppression. And so I'm curious if you could talk more about that. and then I'll just say both questions. And then the second question, I'm a professor at Tulane, and I teach alternative journalism. And it's a strange course, and I feel really blessed to teach it. And the students are learning about radical journalism, the history of black journalism, the history of immigration journalism, the history of feminist journalism, all of it. And what I'm learning is that I have 90% wealthy, white, Northeastern students in New Orleans who have no idea that Katrina even happened, who are completely unaware and who are not taking any action. And I feel grateful that I can waken them, but I don't have that much hope when I see each of these courses of students coming in. And I'm curious what you all might want to say if you could come into my class for 7 minutes and rattle the room. Because all of those kids are the kids of the people, many of the people here, not all of them obviously, have kids that don't necessarily feel ready yet to face what's going on. And I think I'm really with Heather for the rest of my life.
Very good.
Do you want to talk about the lie?
Who wants to talk about the lie? I think you should. Okay.
The truth will set us free, right? And that is clear, right? And let me just say something a little more specific about it. Here's how. So I was speaking with this woman, Rachel, who is a white suburban mom from Oklahoma, and this summer, and she had been born and raised in Oklahoma, attended, Oklahoma public schools, Oklahoma State College, went to graduate school, very educated woman. She said, I did not know about the Tulsa massacre until 3 years ago. So, that's shocking, but how did that affect her? I'm interested in that, right? I'm interested in asking the deeper question of, so what was the cost of that to you, a white suburban mom growing up in Oklahoma, to not know that? And she was one of those people who had that sense of outrage. Like, I have been lied to. This is my history. I'm an Oklahoman. This is my history that I have been robbed of. And she said, I always drove around different neighborhoods and I saw how the black neighborhood was poor. And I had no understanding of why, because history had been robbed. I'd been robbed of the history. And so I had no sense of the causality, anything structural, anything about history that could have made that happen. And so in its place, I ascribed basically racist views, right? That there's just something wrong with black people. Like, we're just allergic to money. We just can't hold on to it somehow, right? It keeps coming out of our hands, right? Our wealth just keeps being, evaporated into thin air, right? And so that's how it works today. That's why it's so important, right? It's so important to a right-wing elite that wants to keep public goods impoverished, that particularly if they're integrated, to have a financial penalty for teaching about integration. I mean, right? Literally, they're trying to weaken and destroy public goods. And so that's, I think, thinking about why the lie is important, right? What function it's having, why the lack of history makes for weaker citizens today who are more easily manipulated, right? That's the most important thing. Who are quicker to believe stereotypes about one another. Like, that's how it actually works in practice.
Okay, we've got a question over here.
Hi, I think it's more of a comment. On April 7th and 8th, HBO aired a 4-hour docuseries called Exterminate All the Brutes. Mm-hmm. If you've seen it, could you raise your hand? Okay, that's what I thought.
Exterminate all the what?
Exterminate all the brutes, the bad guys, B-R-U-T-E-S. And it's from filmmaker Raoul Peck, who created I Am Not Your Negro in 2017. If you saw I Am Not Your Negro, could you raise your hand? That's what I thought. Okay. So I'm the founder of the new Facebook group called the Friends of Raoul Peck. And ever since seeing this film, my entire life has been transformed. He's a Haitian filmmaker. He's 67 years old. He's been making films for 40 years. And all his films are together a body of work. Mm-hmm. But this crowning achievement is Exterminate All the Brutes. And it is, to quote him, the origin story of white supremacism, white supremacy, and genocide. And I strongly urge you all to watch it on high-definition television in the dark with no alcohol in your brain, because it's the most extraordinary film experience I've had in my 74 years, point one. Point two, I envision a mass rally on the Mall as a counterpoint to the insurrection, And it's also going to be the title of Heather's next book, which is
Please, tell me. I'm listening.
The People, THEE, the People. And my vision is that it's a full mall organized by time slots with people coming in and out, and it's music, but it's history, and it's Raoul Peck. But then it's a walk around the Capitol, to circulate around the Capitol until your time slot is over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
for sharing
And
that
let's-
vision.
Yeah, okay. Let's go back.
Over here.
One more question? Yeah.
Quick.
Yeah, yes, these need to be quick. What, hold up the piece of
Answer.
paper. Okay.
It was.
Okay. Quick question.
40 years ago, an anti-racism trainer set me the task of figuring out why it's in my self-interest as a white person to end racism. And Heather McGhee's book really answers that question.
Really does.
I think it's so brilliant. It's the most important book I've read in a really long time. It should be behind people in those PBS, instead of cast, they should have that behind. And I just wondered specifically, I know your whole book is about that, but if you had to express that as a kernel of why is it in white people's self-interest to end racism?
Why don't we take this one last question? Just
And then
and then we'll
Yeah.
wrap it up. Thank you.
Well, this is just a question for Professor Burton, who identified himself as a person of faith, as I am. What role does the faith community have these days with social media? I mean, it was important during Reconstruction. It was important during the Civil Rights Movement. But what's going on today, from your view? Is it relevant?
questions.
You want to do yours?
Sure.
I'm
Just
happy to.
quickly, so I come from an economics background, so I made mostly 9 of the 10 chapters are an economic case as to what helps explain how a country that invented the American dream is now one of the most unequal economies in the world. And it was the inclusion of all of us in those public goods. It was really the civil rights movement that turned us away. The central metaphor in the book is the story of the drained public pools, the idea that there were public goods, a beautiful life when it could be segregated. And once Black people came to the water's edge, many white elites decided to drain the public pools rather than integrate them. And I think that's what happened to our entire economy. But I do include one chapter on the moral cost. And I think on a more fundamental level, there is a spiritual wound that happens from denying your own humanity by denying that of others. And I'll leave that.
Yeah, it's hard to speak about faith briefly, as you know, and things. I used to argue, in fact, one of the problems with the South, and maybe it's come to the nation, that we were all very slow readers, and they never got through the Old Testament, where, God said, kill all the people and animals and all of that, and to the central teaching of there are no strangers and love your neighbor. Things like that. But it is a complicated thing, and the church is rational. The institutional church has really a part of it, having gone from being the backbone of the abolitionist movement to certainly central to the civil rights movement and other issues. There's a group who really have taken, I don't know what they've taken, but, I'm not so sure I care if there's a heaven, but it'd be very hard for me to be in a heaven if these people who have taken religion and used it in the way they have in terms of race, not to be burning in hell with what they've done with religion. So it's hard to get into, but I think you see some hopes. You see with this recent, was it Jones and the Southern Baptist, who are finally speaking up. A little late, but at least they're doing it, and we believe in what I like the word redemption for. We do believe that people can change. Maybe I'll end with a quick story that John Lewis told me when my co-author Armand Durfner and I were at a meeting in Washington with him, and somehow I said something about smart aleckly, I should have known better, that I couldn't believe that so many African Americans were voting for George Wallace, and he claims he changed. And John Lewis looked at me and he said directly, I remember this much, well, Vernon, if you can't believe that John Lewis changed, you don't believe what I almost was killed for and what we fought for, because we believed that we can change people. He went on and gave examples. And I think that in that sense, as we said, this is such a teachable moment. Maybe we can call for a true redemption to change people, to have them look at their faith in ways to say, what does this faith really say, beyond how demagogues within the church themselves have been using it, and certainly politicians been using code words.
I want to thank our wonderful panel, and I want to encourage you all to come back to the festival tomorrow and Sunday, when you will get to hear these authors talk about their books. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Barbara for moderating so beautifully.